And so now, without any further delay, I'm excited to move on to our main event for tonight. We're incredibly happy and honored this evening to have with us Thomas Dohmke, the CEO of GitHub and the visionary behind GitHub Copilot. I'm really excited about this conversation because not only is Thomas a seasoned executive and one of the great leaders in AI, he's also a multiple repeat startup founder, an engineer, a software developer, and an open source advocate. Like many of us, I think he describes himself as a nerd, and he's incredibly generous about making himself available to everybody in the community, at events, and online. Thomas grew up in pre-unification East Berlin, where nevertheless he discovered the joys of technology and software engineering. He completed his PhD in mechanical engineering at the University of Glasgow. And then he switched back and forth between founding startups and working at large organizations like Daimler, Chrysler, and Bosch. In 2011, he founded a company called Hockey App that develops DevOps solutions for code testing and analysis, and they were acquired by Microsoft in 2014. I think that DevOps was really just a precursor to his work at GitHub and now GitHub Copilot. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Dohmke. And Thomas, I know it's on Zoom, so you probably can't hear like the boisterous round of applause and cheering, but I'm sure we've got that. So just believe that it's there. Welcome.
Hey Keith, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to join you and have the conversation and be here with all these founders and hackers and doing stuff. Really exciting to see.
Yeah, super. So, just to get to know you a little bit better, something I admire about you is that despite your demanding schedule, running a company, joining Zoom sessions, talking to people, you still seem to find time to do coding. And I'm wondering if there's like a personal coding project of yours that you can tell us about and why it's exciting.
Yeah, I actually have two projects. I think one is open source and the other one is private for now because I'm embarrassed about the code quality, and it's both apps on my iPhone because that always travels with me wherever I go. So I'd love to have my software in my pocket. One is a simple app that one is open source that it's called Hedged. It's like health app data Git exporter. So it basically takes your workout data, runs and walks and whatnot, and exports it into a CSV file on GitHub. And then you can run GitHub actions on it and do whatever you want to do with it. And obviously it combines like my hobbies, running and working out with my job, GitHub. And the other one is a very simple closed source app where I track all my flights and I pull the flight data into a NoSQL database as JSON. And so I know every time I board a plane here in Seattle, Alaska Airlines, and whether I've been on that exact same plane before or not. And so it's a bit of a, I see the tail number, like the license plate of the plane, and then you know whether you've been on that plane or not. And maybe one day I've been on all the Alaska Airlines planes.
Can't you just like make a little scratch on the back of the seat or something? And like,
I don't know if I've gotten to the point where they always give me the exact same seat.
Well, I love this sports app. I actually also have that issue of exporting sports data, and I always want to integrate them. And it's like a very difficult thing to like go integrate with everything and then try to like overlay things so they work together. So
well, you can always come to my open source project and contribute back to it, or it's on test flights. You can just go and install it on your iPhone. It runs in the background, so it doesn't need a lot of stuff. Every time you finish a workout, it just exports this into your GitHub repo.
Super cool. Sign me up. Okay. In addition to being a coder, you're also a multiple-time founder, and I think maybe one question that everybody here in the audience would appreciate is like, what do you think the most important thing our future founders ought to be doing that they're probably missing?
Yeah. Giving advice is always dangerous because you never know where people are in their journey. But I think what people should not be doing, what they're probably doing is worry too much about the big tech companies and the competition and what large companies might be doing around them, and being anxious about that. Microsoft has so many developers, so if they decide to go into your space, they might just crush you. that's all wrong from my perspective. You shouldn't be worrying about what the big companies do. They get dragged down, they get slowed down so much. They're fighting, all the hierarchies and the politics, and then sitting in meetings all day long. And at the end of the day, we'd like to think about the tech industry as a zero-sum game, and it's not. And it's not. There's always going to be multiple players in every single space. A lot of technology survives for a really long time. The most prominent example right now is COBOL, the programming language that was invented in the late 50s when Eisenhower was the president, and it's still around and it runs in any bank CTO or CIO I've met in the last year, and those are multiple dozens, all have talked to me about the pain that they have with running COBOL. And so they haven't replaced that. And so they need still people working on that. And so technology survives for a long time. You as a startup founder are always able to find a new angle, a new perspective, a disruption in your space. Go build that thing and don't worry not what Microsoft, what Amazon, what Google are doing. You will find, the thing that you love and that hopefully makes this world a better place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I definitely have seen a lot of great building this week. So
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll get just a taste of that this weekend. But absolutely, you shouldn't be scared. That's what holds you back, I think. Turning to Copilot for a minute, Copilot isn't just a new feature or product, right? It's like an entirely new category for how we should use AI. And it's not the AI that's replacing us. It's the AI that's our super assistant, making us faster and better at what we do. And there's a lot of wondering, like, okay, what does that actually mean for our workflows? What does that mean for our daily lives as we figure out how to use all the copilots that are showing up? And, I know at GitHub, your engineers have more experience working with Copilot than anyone else. Have you noticed if your teams have made changes in the way that they work? And what do they do differently?
Our lives are going to get so much better. If you think about what developers do every day, and hopefully they write code most of the time. Although I think that even that is, very different in large companies versus small agile startups. But they write code. A lot of that code is just boilerplate. Mundane things like unit tests, and you test, for an empty value and a sorted array, and unsorted array, and an array with duplicate values, and an array with negative values, right? Just the simple things, and in testing is so much stuff, and you have to come up with this all over again as a developer. And so it takes away that boilerplate, that mundane task, and gives you more time to focus on the things that are really fun, which are the creative pieces of coding and really of professional workers. And so what we're seeing at GitHub, what we saw early on, is that our developers love Copilot. NPS was through the roof, and Net Promoter Score was through the roof in the staff ship, like the prototype that we shipped in early 2021. So 2.5 years ago, our internal developers were excited, and we see this now as Copilot has gained so much more traction in the market that developers are truly happy after they use Copilot, or while they're using Copilot. They have less repetitive work, they need less mental energy to get stuff done, and they feel more fulfilled when they're done with the task. And it's this, I always describe it as it's a once-in-a-lifetime product, because all the developers, the users of the product, are actually happy, but the management is also happy because they're seeing these productivity gains. It's depending on what case study you're looking at, it writes almost half the code. It makes developers twice as fast. Developers accept between 30 and 35% of the suggestions that are shown to them. And so the management is happy. Those business decision makers that are buying the product, but the user is actually also happy. And usually developers are like, I don't want anything new, Thomas. Don't touch my system. I know what I'm doing. I've been using this setup and this keyboard layout and whatnot for 10 years. But no. Our users, our developers are really happy about Copilot, and I think we haven't really seen that in a long time with developer tools.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Are like code reviews changing?
Code reviews, are also going to change with AI. We have, internally a new version of Copilot that helps you with pull request review, and you can summarize the pull request. So it actually takes you no longer have to describe all the things that you just did. As a developer, when you write code and then you submit your pull request, everything is obvious to you, right? Because you just did it, and so you can just say, Copilot, describe this pull request to my coworkers. and it will help you to review source code. And so you can, just ask for changes. You don't have to wait for your coworkers that might be in a different time zone halfway around the world to wake up and review your pull request. You can just have Copilot do that for you. All the way to, probably fixing security issues, generating tests during CI/CD, making your pull request more complete. What we also, at Microsoft, we have effectively every developer, one way or another, is using Copilot now. And so we see that they're submitting more pull requests. We see that the build time per pull request is going down because they can iterate faster, and that they're merging more pull requests. Now, that's not peer-reviewed data yet, but we will, soon enough publish more studies on this. And it's early days for AI and how it's changing the workforce, but developers are clearly at the forefront of that adoption curve.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because, a lot of people out here who are building apps and stuff are trying to figure out how to work with this. And we're trying to figure out how to put interfaces on the front or the back or on the side of AI. And GitHub is really sort of pioneering those routes as we do it, which, actually takes me to maybe my next question, because Copilot really is coming up with new ways of interacting with code. And it's not just like type and get the code completion anymore. Now I can chat with Copilot and I can say, what do you think about this? And it kind of gives me some hints. I can use voice. And I think, you've even talked about how do we use natural language to actually do programming, because that's a little bit of like something we all kind of dream about. Right now, you work with Copilot and maybe in a natural language, and it generates another language, which is like Python or C or whatever, because those were rigorous languages meant to talk to computer compilers and stuff like that. But now that we're using Copilot, maybe we don't need those. Like, do you think like maybe there are different intermediate languages? And maybe the flip side of that is I also see that like the prompts are also getting like super complicated. They're almost like a programming language themselves. So what's the future of programming?
Yeah, Python doesn't actually speak with the computer either, right? Like it gets sent through a compiler or interpreter and then compiled into sometimes an intermediate language like in the .NET ecosystem, or straight, to a binary, and that binary speaks with your CPU. And if you think about that, we have gone through that transition forever, right? Like we started with punch cards with holes in them, where in a way, the first programming language for these machines, and then we moved to assembly, and assembly is one way of controlling the CPU to do what you want to achieve. And then we came to BASIC, and Python came, and C and C++ and all these languages, and then came the internet, and with the internet came all these open source libraries. And in fact, the collaboration of open source developers around the world has, and I think you're going to see that in the next 2 days during the pitches and the reviews, right? Like my assumption is most of these hacks, most of these projects from this week are building on top of an open source library, an open source operating system, open source compiler. In fact, if we look into like our customer projects, whether it's a big enterprise or whether it's a small startup, they're all 90% open source under the hood. They might not be open source themselves, but certainly what they're using from Linux, Docker containers, Kubernetes, Python, GitHub, obviously, they're using a lot of open source within their stack. And whether you're in a big company or in a startup, it would be crazy to start a new project and first build your own version of React and build your own version of payment processing library and whatnot. And so we've gone through this transition from very hardware focused programming, where you had to understand the CPU and the caches. And when I started, it was cassette tapes that you would load software from. So load times were a real big thing. We went from that to relying on the work of millions of open source developers and owning like a thin layer of 10% on top of that. And so that's going to shift even further to having AI write 80% of that code. I think it will be for a long time still code that is this intermediate language between us humans and the computer, but it will more and more that we interact with human language with that code, explaining the code, debugging the code, optimizing it, asking it to make it look better. And the magic is that it doesn't only work in English. Now, I'm assuming, everybody on that call speaks English, because otherwise you can't hear what Keith and I are saying. But I grew up in German, right? And when I was 6 years old, I spoke German. And to learn coding, I had to learn English first, or a little bit of English, because most of documentation, most of the books, most of open source stuff today is still predominantly English. And so you're excluding a huge population of kids in the world if you need to learn English before you can learn coding. Well, with Copilot and ChatGPT and these other agents, you can actually just use your human language, whether it's German, whether it's, Hindi, Brazilian, Portuguese, French, it doesn't really matter. And you can even ask it to write code for you with an English description. So you can still share that code with others. And in fact, we have seen these examples with ChatGPT, write professional emails and professional, messages to folks. And so it democratizes access through a natural language, through human language, while under the hood, of course, our computers are still very deterministic, and they need to have some machine language to operate. Maybe there's a future where Copilot doesn't synthesize code anymore, and it just, runs on your Nest thermostat, and if you tell it something, it interprets what you want exactly in that situation. And so if you say in summer you're warm, it turns down the AC, but when you're saying in winter you're warm, it might not go as down, and just stops the heat a little bit, right? Like, and you can imagine a lot of those situations where ordering your lunch, I like Thai food. So if I order, pad Thai from Uber Eats, it can probably figure out itself where I want that from, and how spicy I want it, right? And that's the power of human language, that you can replace a lot of these mundane tasks, the spoilerplate of life, and automate that, same as dishwashers has automated doing the dishes. Somewhat.
My dishwasher is getting smarter too, unfortunately.
Until you go to like a cabin in the Olympic National Park and it doesn't have a dishwasher, and you're spending your Saturday night doing the dishes, and your kids look at you and when we were kids, this is what it was like.
Yeah, exactly. This is before we had when we still had to do the boilerplate. I was going to ask this later, but you kind of just queued this up, so maybe I'll ask it now. If copilots really do change that, like they do 85% of the work, this is the 80-20 or whatever, and we don't have to write the tests, we don't have to write the integrations, we don't have to figure out how to connect to Azure or whatever it is. Do you think that's going to change the way we think about programming? Are we going to all become architects only, or how is that going to change?
Yeah, probably not, because we have so much legacy code or tech debt sitting around, no matter what, that you always need to know both. But I think certainly we will up-level, similar to how we up-leveled from not using open source to using lots of open source. If you have a project today, Ruby on Rails application, you're likely not understanding how 80% of those libraries actually work until that moment where something doesn't work and you have to take the debugger and go step by step into these lines to try to understand what the Rails team built and how they intended this to work, right? And all of a sudden you go from, I'm just a user of an open source library, to somebody who has to understand some of the concepts all the way down to lines of code, or maybe even bugs in that code. And so I think it's a mix of these two things, and certainly, and I'm sure a lot of the founders on the call today had that decision on Monday or Tuesday when they started their project, right? Like, okay, so which database do I use? Which cloud do I use? And do I build it on top of a container, or do I just abstract that completely away and go serverless? And do I go into multiple regions, or do I just run on my iPhone? And there's so much software, and it's like the software running on your iPhone versus the software running on the cloud versus the Zoom service over the GitHub or Facebook, all the way to point of sale systems and whatnot. They're all architecturally very, very different, and you have to make a lot of decisions as developers and a startup founder every single day, and those are hard because there's not one right answer. there's not one answer for the cloud, and there's not one answer for the infrastructure, certainly not for the database, right? Like MySQL versus Postgres versus MS SQL, we could have lots of drinks and arguments over which one of those is the best one. And, at Madrona and as part of, your startup boards, you often have these discussions with your startup founders. What's the right path for them in the current situation? And that's the same, for a CEO, founder, for an operator, and for a software developer. The decision is still with us, and the experience and sometimes the gut feelings we have. And so I think, we will hopefully still understand the technology and be able to dive deep when we need to. And certainly we need to maintain the millions of lines of code that are written every single day. But we will up level when we don't need to, and can just ask AI to design a module for us.
I love that vision. A lot because of what you said, but also because, one of the landmines you run into as a startup founder, anyone trying to do something on the edge, is that lots of the new stuff out there, maybe even open source, is not terribly well documented.
Yeah.
Even corporate stuff is not well documented. and there is no greater waste of time than like starting down a path with something you think is going to work. And then you're like, I don't know what the answer is. Spend a lot of time. But so if AI can help us with that,
well,
that would be huge.
Keith, there's obviously also a very big difference between what you build during a hackathon, what you build during an MVP phase, what you build before you have product market fit until your first million, and then what you build when you have to scale from 100 to 1 billion, right? Like the scale requirements are like growing with the company, and you can't just build that final product on day one because it will cost you too much and takes way too long, and then you have invested all that money and ultimately your lifetime into something that has no product market fit. And so you will need the pilot, to make the right decision for the step in the journey you're in. And the AI, quote unquote, the machine learning model that ultimately is just a probability machine, will not be able to tell you and make that decision for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to pause really quick because I'm loving this conversation, but I'm also supposed to tell the audience they're allowed to ask questions also.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep asking questions, but if anybody has them, post them in the chat. Jimmy will percolate them up, and I'm happy to ask those as well. Meanwhile, so, one of the other cool things about GitHub Copilot is that it spawned a whole bunch of other copilots. We now have Office 365 Copilot. We have Jira Copilot. Like there's all these copilots everywhere. And, one of the things about writing code is that, context is everything. And context isn't just the 100 lines of code first and the 100 lines of code after. It's also like, what was the dev thinking? And what was that bug ticket like? And what is the product supposed to look like? And what was the user complaining about? And so, you probably get a lot of requests, like, how do I integrate that stuff into GitHub Copilot? So given that there are all these copilots around, is there a world where they all talk to each other? What does that look like?
I mean, I really hope so, that world where all the copilots are connected with each other through, a knowledge graph, a knowledge layer, will exist soon. Today, the copilot that we have at GitHub, the one that auto-completes and the one that chats with you, is not connected to outside systems. It is connected to the context it has in your editor. So it knows where the cursor is and what's above the cursor and what's below the cursor, and adjacent files, and newer versions actually can access your whole workspace. And you can just say add workspace and ask questions about the project. And you can kind of see a future where, it connects to GitHub repos and GitHub issues and in Teams, and M365 Copilot connects into the SharePoint world. And so, in Copilot Word, what you have done before, maybe in PowerPoint or in a Teams meeting. And so some of those connection points already exist because of the platforms those Copilot run on, like GitHub or SharePoint. And OpenAI earlier this year introduced this concept of a plugin where you can, as a developer, write a plugin that the model then can call to pull in additional information, right? Like one plugin that's available today in ChatGPT is Expedia. And so you can ask Expedia, about flights and hotels. And because the model naturally was only trained to a certain cutoff point for GPT-4. I think it's today, September 2021. And so if you want to know about flights out of SeaTac tonight, the model doesn't know because the flight plan for SeaTac tonight was not available in September 2021, but you can connect the model to an API. So if you are asking what are the flights tonight out of SeaTac, it knows, okay, so I query the API of the Seattle Port Authority or whatever, and get that information, and it can answer the question, right? And it's very similar to when you want to summarize something in ChatGPT, you can just copy and paste, you know, the Madrona blog post from last week into ChatGPT, and then say, summarize this blog post to me, and what is the, you know, the key takeaways. And you know, the prompting sometimes is funny because then pretend I'm a business analyst, you know, what do the Madrona investors want to tell me between the lines, and those kind of things, right? But instead of me copying and pasting this, Madrona could then offer an agent, a plugin for OpenAI ChatGPT to do that automatically, and you can just say, what is Madrona thinking today? And so you can, you know, see a world where Copilot will do all of that built in, and all the Copilots will connect through these agents with the internet and with each other.
Totally. You know, that's, the plugins are one way that Copilot and OpenAI get smarter, and you can make them work for you. Another thing, you know, that I'm sure you get lots of requests about, I've seen them, in fact, of course, you know, the race is on for fine tuning in Copilot applications, right? It's one thing to be trained on the body of everybody's code. It's a different thing to think about my code or the other things that I need to do. What can you say about the roadmap for fine tuning in Copilot?
But Ronald really wants me to publish all my roadmap on this call. No, I mean, we have been quite, you know, we have been open about this. Fine tuning is an interesting topic. It has upsides and downsides. You know, maybe to quickly explain how it works is, you know, take the publicly available model, GPT-5, GPT 3.5 or GPT-4. You put it into an Azure environment, you upload your own code or your own data, and you can tune some of the parameters of the model. And while you do that, you spin the same NVIDIA GPUs that were originally used to train the model, and so it costs money. And so that's the first downside of fine-tuning is you have to spend compute cycles to create your customized version of the model. It's a bit like tuning your car. Now you have a modified version of that car. What happens if the manufacturer launches a new car, aka what happens if there's GPT 4.1 or 4.2 or whatever the next version is? I don't know, by the way, so I'm just making numbers up. Now you have the question, do I take all the benefits that OpenAI gives me through that new model, or do I, you know, keep my fine-tuned model, right? And it's effectively like a fork, right? Because you can't just take that new model into the fine-tune environment. You have to refine-tune, so you have to spend the same compute cycles again. And the other challenge with fine-tuning on code is that, well, you know, if you're a large enough company, you have code in very many programming languages. At Microsoft, we have quite literally everything. GitHub is on Ruby on Rails, and the Windows team is mostly in C and C++, and increasingly on C#. You know, a lot of Azure is written in C#, but there's also a ton of TypeScript and Go and Rust and you name it. So now, which code do you actually use to fine-tune the model? Or do you then have a Windows version of the model and an Office version of the model and a GitHub version of the model and a LinkedIn version of the model? That's really expensive if you keep going down that route. There is certainly benefits from fine-tuning, better, more accurate results. You can kind of like tell the model to learn a programming language that might not be part of the public training set. You know, some companies have internal languages, or there's some ecosystems that don't have a lot of open source or a lot of blog posts and Stack Overflow answers and whatnot. And so if you want more accurate answers from the model, it is a path to go. But I actually think it is a very, you know, specific path for a certain type of customer, but the majority of customers will live with what is called retrieval augmented generation, which is similar to the plugin system we described earlier. It leverages your local context, maybe remote context or intentional context you gave it by copy and pasting, or by just saying, hey, I want the information from SeaTac Airport to be pulled into the prompt window that's used to run inference.
I think that's good. I think it helps to think about it as part of a suite of ways, right? You have a bunch of ways to get this kind of performance. You should think about what you want to do, the upsides and downsides of how you do it. That's a new way of thinking about coding and stuff, is how do I make those kinds of choices about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super cool. This line of questioning did kick off a couple audience questions, which is really good. One of the questions, and you know, I probably had a similar one, was, you know, okay, so there's that feature. Are there any other features maybe coming up in Copilot that startup founders ought to be looking for, you know, in the near future? What's cool and coming up that you're able to tell us about?
First of all, this is a great chance for me to plug our startup program. We have a GitHub startup program where startups can get free access to GitHub, to GitHub Enterprise, and you can get started on GitHub for a while without paying us any money. And so that's certainly a benefit that we provide to you all. And then Copilot itself, it's been a while since I met a startup that hasn't been using Copilot. Copilot Autocompletion, Copilot Chat are both available. You can use them to start writing your code, and you know, in VS Code, you can just type /tests, and it generates you a whole class of unit tests. And so whether you're hacking right now, you know, or whether you're working on a feature next week, it makes you so much faster in doing these things. As we, you know, progress, we already talked about plugins. I think that will be a big opportunity for both startups leveraging those plugins, you know, to integrate with the rest of their you know, tool chain, but also for startups to provide these plugins and basically become a Copilot native startup. You know, we used to separate in cloud native and old school companies. I think there will be AI native or Copilot native pretty soon, where startups think about chat specifically as the new predominant user interface, or the user interface of the future, if you will, where the puck is going to be, not where it's right now, right? Right now we're still living mostly in user interfaces that rely on us tapping on something or clicking something. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, like if you think about ordering a car or ordering food, or there's so many interactions, booking flights, where you're much faster by just telling the chat agent what you want to do. And more often than not, there's only one right answer, because it already knows what airline you prefer and then what location you on Maui want to go to, or it can give you these options instead of you trying to find these. And so in Copilot, you know, startups should think about what they could provide as additional context, as additional integration point. And then we will have AI throughout the developer lifecycle. We will have it in pull request reviews. We'll have it in CI/CD. You know, one of Madrona startups is OctoML, so it uses ML to deploy ML models to the cloud, right? That's the double ML in the thing, but there's certainly AI already there that makes deploying your AI models more efficient and better for the model that you're deploying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that'll be really slick when that stuff starts to happen. There was another question out there, and I'm going to fold it into something I had, which is, you know, whenever any new technology like this comes out, people try to mess with it. That's kind of what hackers are. You know, with OpenAI, we had Dan, the evil Chat GPT breakout. And, you know, overall, there's always a concern about governance of general AI models and systems and how to manage them. One, like, have you seen people trying to use Copilot in the wrong way or in a weird way? And you know, what was that? And what are your thoughts about governance of these kinds of models?
You know, obviously you always see, you know, a certain level of people trying to figure out the boundaries of a system. When Bing Chat came out in February, you know, the Sydney experiments of Kevin Rose from New York Times will probably be in our memories for quite some time. But at the same time, ever since, you know, nothing to that degree has actually happened, right? Like if you think back for the last, what's February, it's October now, so it's like 8 months. There hasn't been another Kevin Rose Sydney, as at least the news I follow. And in GitHub, when we launched chat and rolled it out and let people from the waitlist in, of course, folks, looked at what is the hidden prompt, the instructions for the model. And it's similar to software piracy and things like you can spend so much time in trying to prevent people from doing that. It's sometimes easier to just make this public or make it so easy that they find out, put it on Hacker News. Okay, then it's out there. And now people know what those things are. We see them trying to, hack things. And then, in the preview, it's on us to fix those bugs or fix those vectors that create unsafe, environments where the code output is hackable or something like that. Overall, I'd say, at Microsoft, given we have been in this AI space for, quite a while, and, we've gone through our own learnings over the years, our responsible AI pipeline is very strong. And we're learning every day on how to make it even better. And so we are, excited about the opportunity from a productivity and developer happiness perspective, but also from in those early days of AI to actually learn from these attacks. They're no different than bug bounties or red team exercises, because of course we do those internally too. We have whole red teams on the AI side that try to hack the model, and outside hackers do that too, and they do that on our production systems with or without AI. And then hopefully they follow a responsible process of submitting those findings and cash in the bounty if they qualify for that. And so we learn from that as society. We learn from that as users, and we learn from it as a company. And at the same time, we're benefiting from that AI technology early on. And it's very human, we started driving cars before there were seatbelts and airbags, and there was no ABS and ESP and whatnot. But all of a sudden you could get from, Seattle to Vancouver in a couple of hours instead of, a 10-day horse ride or something, right? Like, and or maybe 10 days sounds long, but I don't know. But there's the benefits of AI that specifically for developers have created a paradigm shift of how we work as developers, more productive and more happy, more fulfilled, and then also a learning to navigate the risks. And we're working, with Open Source Foundation and the regulators on a daily basis to really create that environment where we all benefit from AI.
Yeah, I think so. I know this is a big topic at Black Hat this year. It was like the leading topic. Everybody spent a lot of time. And also sometimes, hackers reveal really interesting things that you didn't know about the technology. That's that kind of cool. Has GitHub Copilot ever done anything that really surprised you?
I think, what surprised me from the early start is that I could actually write code. Like it really surprised me that when we looked at GPT-3 3 years ago in 2020, at the height of the COVID lockdown, we were experimenting with early versions of GPT-3, and it was actually able to write correct code, parentheses in the right places and semicolons and if then and the model itself it's not a compiler, right? It understands language from the training set, but it doesn't have a hard-coded understanding of this is Python, this is JavaScript, this is Ruby, and you should not intermingle the keywords, and you should not use the syntax from one and the other. That's not hard-coded at all in the model. It's just trained through the training process and through the training set, and yet it's able to keep those things apart and write fully functional Python code. And OpenAI earlier this year launched a feature called Code Interpreter, and now it's advanced data analysis. And you can just ask it, to download data from an API and render a chart, and you can execute that straight from the chat window to plot data points or process them and things like that. And that actually works without you going in and then modifying and fixing the bugs that model might have made, is I think still surprising to me. And I would have never thought when we started working on Copilot that we get to a point where it writes 20% of the code, and then we saw telemetry 25%, and we're like, that the data must be wrong, and let's have a look again of actually measuring correctly. And then earlier this year, we published that it's 46% of all code, and as much as on average, right? So in files where Copilot is enabled, half of the code is coming from Copilot, and some like Java, it's 62%. And the joke always is it's because of all the try-catch blocks, because they're easily predictable, right? Like once you have a string operation, you always know afterwards you have to catch the null pointer exception. And but that also shows you how powerful this really is, that we have a machine learning model that can write half the code. If as a developer you kind of get into it and you know a little bit how to write your comments for your method and a few short examples of inputs and outputs values. So it is, I think the technology itself is still so surprising every single day. And sometimes I give keynotes on stage where I code stuff live, and that surprises me that actually works and doesn't fall apart when I'm in front of 5,000 people and they're looking at my code and they're like, oh my God, what's going to happen now?
Yeah, most of us hope that we can write code well ahead of the demo and that it might possibly work when we give it on stage. So writing code live is a whole nother level.
I mean, it's like stand-up comedy, right? Where you never know what the audience will do and what they throw at you, and you never know what the model throws at you and what solution it will give you today. And so, but the nice thing is then you rehearse not to write exactly the same line of code over and over again. You rehearse how to react to whatever the model gives you, and it's fun because you can also tell Chat GPT and Copilot that the answer is wrong, and it says, oh, I apologize, here's another way of approaching this. And obviously it doesn't mean it apologizing. That's just the next probable thing when you tell somebody they're wrong.
That's great. I have one last question. It's actually from the audience. I think it's a great question. Can you share the story about the founding of Copilot at GitHub? How did that actually come about? And how did you convince anybody it was like kind of a good idea?
Yeah, I already mentioned, we started in 2020 in early June, I think, May or June. It was right after the Microsoft Build conference, which at that year, was all virtual because of the pandemic. And Sam Altman and Kevin Scott had talked at the conference about transformers and GPT-3, and we got access and we hopped on a Zoom call. And Uge de Moor, one of our VPs at the time, running the GitHub Next team, which is kind of like our incubation Horizon 3 team, had the keyboard, and we were dictating to Uge prompts and kind of like render a Python method that sorts an array, or write JavaScript that posts a tweet. And we were kind of like similar to this, a bit more interactive, but looking at what the model would do, and it was like, oh, this actually works. And then give it this, and then obviously you can also get answers that are broken. Back then it was early days, and so we started to work with OpenAI and Microsoft to create this tuned version of back then GPT-3 called Codex, which was tuned on open source code. And we asked internally developers to submit programming exercises in Python. What you would give people for an interview loop. It has like a description and a method declaration and then a body, but you strip out the body and you ask the applicant to fill in the body and see if they can, solve FizzBuzz or something like that. And so we asked the model to fill in the body, that GPT-3 and then the Codex model, and was able to solve 92% of these 230 or so programming exercises, right? 92% 3 years ago. And that was the moment where we were all like, okay, we're onto something here, and let's build a product that makes developers more productive. Quite frankly, in our own interest, because we're a software development company, and as every software development company, we're struggling between all the tech debt and all the compliance tasks and all the stuff that Microsoft wants us to do, to be within the fundamentals, accessibility and things like that, and all the innovative ideas that we have, right? And as an engineering manager, you're constantly struggling between those two buckets of work: the innovation and the fundamentals, and the cleaning up code and refactoring and rewriting something, right? And so we wanted to make that better, and so we started building Copilot, and the rest became history.
That must have been so exciting, and it's still exciting. Like, I'm more excited every day to see how this.
I think it sounds more exciting now than it was back then. Obviously, you're excited about the possibilities. But the model obviously wasn't perfect back then and isn't perfect right now. And so I think the hardest part and the best decision in hindsight that we made is that we met developers where they are, which is in the editor. We didn't invent a new user interface for the original Copilot, the OG Copilot. We created autocompletion, AI-based autocompletion, and you don't have to write a prompt. You just write code, and then it predicts the next line and the next method and unit tests and whatnot. And in the meantime, chat plays a much bigger role, but at the time we couldn't have built chat as the model wasn't good enough for that. And so we focused on what we can build with the technology that is available to us.
Well, that's a good takeaway for everybody. Really good. Thank you so much, Thomas. I warned everybody that the timekeepers are serious and they're sending me messages right now. So I think we are at the end of time. Thank you again. It has really been a pleasure to have you here talking with us. Really appreciate the audience questions. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. And looking forward to seeing everybody this weekend on Pitch Day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the conversation, and have fun with all the pitches tomorrow and Sunday.